everybody. My name is Bob Gaterma. I'm the CEO here at the China Project, and I'm really excited to have three experts here in the China watching world, in the legal and risk world, to talk about complying with new U.S. regulations on China. By extension, we'll undoubtedly touch on Chinese regulations too, because it's sort of a two-way road. I'm going to give a brief introduction to the three panelists. Then I'm going to give some opening remarks, and we'll get to our first question. So our first panelist is Fei Ren, and she is a lawyer in the international department at Miller Chevalier, and focuses her practice on government enforcement actions, internal investigations, international corporate compliance, and sanctions and export controls. So suffice to say, those are some of the buzzwords that we'll be covering today. Isaac Stonefish is the CEO of Strategy Risks, which is a provider of critical political analysis, due diligence, data, and risk management that focuses, among other things, on quantifying the ties between corporations, individuals, and China. And Matthew Rabinovitz is a partner at Pillsbury Winthrop Shaw Pittman, based in Washington, D.C., and covers a wide range of similar topics: export controls, compliance, international legal affairs along these lines. So really excited to have everybody here. Thank you for joining. On August 9th, Joe Biden signed an executive order prohibiting new U.S. investment in China in sensitive technologies such as semiconductors, quantum information technologies, certain AI systems. This comes on top of years of CFIUS pressure and tension, if you will, on deals being done in the U.S. or investments being done in the U.S. The CHIPS Act of last October, which restricted not only companies and certain activities, but also individuals from working with Chinese semiconductor firms. The kind of ever-expanding U.S. entity list, which bars U.S. companies from doing any form of business with certain Chinese companies. How can international companies continue doing business with the world's second largest economy while staying kosher in the world's largest economy, in the U.S.? Are there more rules in the pipeline? Is where we're at kind of as bad as it's going to get, or is it going to get worse? There's no end to the variables in play here. And so I'm really looking to digging into it. We've mentioned the outbound investment regulations from just a few weeks ago. We've mentioned CFIUS. We've mentioned the CHIPS Act. My first question is going to be for Matthew, and I want to ask if there are other important laws or regulations from the U.S. side that deserve equal attention that may not be getting enough, headline attention.
Thanks, Bob. Yeah, and thanks for the helpful overview here. Yeah, I think from our perspective, focusing on international trade, export controls are just a key area of focus of the administration when it comes to maintaining, what the government has said, maintaining a technological advantage, right, in the United States. So the focus is on those, what's been called emerging technologies and foundational technologies that are key to semiconductor production. So like you alluded to, last October, there were a series of export controls looking at advanced computing, semiconductor manufacturing equipment. And since that point in time, there has been a lot of discussion and debate over expanding those controls or modifying those controls in a way to help further U.S. National security and foreign policy objectives. A lot of the focus has been around, the advanced computing, GPUs, accelerators, AI type chips. And even with the controls that were put in place last year, China's ability to, I wouldn't use the word circumvent, but navigate those controls to then acquire modified chips that can, when stacked together, combined, used in different ways through the use of cloud computing services, still achieve the same advanced computing functionality. So we're watching and waiting for likely new export control rules that would reportedly come out this month, looking to expand, modify, tweak those controls from last year, and again, further inhibit, restrict a focus on advanced computing, AI chips, and semiconductor production, because that's where the U.S. is really focused on securing the semiconductor supply chain and making sure, to the extent possible, key semiconductor technologies remain in the U.S. as much as they can be, or with our allied partners.
Got it. So we may see an expansion of the current set of tools that are already on the table, but there aren't necessarily any major laws or other areas of regulatory activity that somehow we're not aware of.
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest, right, is sort of the topic for du jour is the outbound investment rule, right? Because at this stage, right, the President Biden executive order set forth a directive for the Treasury Department to issue some form of framework to regulate outbound investment. And so as of today, I think it's important for folks on the line to know, as of today, there is no outbound investment rule, right? The Treasury Department is tasked with setting forth regulations. They've set forth an advance notice of proposed rulemaking, which outlines their thinking. And so what we envision is 2 tracks: notifications and prohibitions. So it's going to be very important to monitor how those rules shape out. There's no timeline, but we expect it sometime, later next year, that will set forth categories of investments focusing on AI, quantum, and semiconductor that are maybe prohibited or require notification. And that's going to impact U.S. funds, U.S. persons, wherever located in the world. So similar to last year, when we saw a lot of executives at semiconductor companies face challenges because of their U.S. person status, even though they're overseas, we'll likely see the same thing for U.S. persons abroad who are directing investment decisions in advanced, semiconductor and other AI type companies within China. So it's announced, right? But there is nothing yet, and we're closely monitoring because there will be a framework in place likely next year.
Got it. That's really helpful. Just to drill down one more step on this issue, there were export controls in the CHIPS Act from October 7th of last year.
Mm-hmm.
And then there have been further export controls either already implemented or talked about. Are they the same thing? Is this literally an expansion of the CHIPS Act, or are these kind of different angles or pecks, if you will, at the bigger problem from different places?
Yeah, and the CHIPS Act and export control sort of go hand in hand, because the CHIPS Act is really legislation intended to encourage U.S. domestic semiconductor supply chain production. And so the idea is, through financial incentives, encourage building out semiconductor facilities in the U.S., building out semiconductor design in the U.S., trying to secure the supply chain, while what they call national security guardrails to ensure that those parties in China don't have access to that CHIPS Act funding, right? That's where the CHIPS Act puts these guardrails in place. The export controls from last year are all coming from the Commerce Department. It's called BIS, that's the Bureau of Industry and Security. They're the agency within the Commerce Department that is responsible for administering export controls. And they're the ones who have focused on advanced computing, semiconductor equipment, and imposing outbound restrictions on technology, hardware, software that would prohibit sending, let's say an EDA design, semiconductor design tool, right? The use of those tools in China is subject to export control requirements. Use of certain semiconductor equipment made by U.S. and other, and other jurisdictions are putting in similar export controls to restrict manufacturing equipment. So these are all restrictions on what you send to China that will be expanded, modified, whereas CHIPS Act is incentives to build in the U.S. and secure the supply chain. So go hand in hand, but it sort of speaks to the web of regulations that are so hard to follow, so much going on. And the administration is trying to keep up with all the ways in which they can use these different tools to achieve foreign policy and national security goals.
Got it. That's really helpful.
Bob,
sounds like go ahead, Feifei. Yeah.
Oh, I was just want to add one more point to Matt's point. So he talked about incentivizing U.S. companies and controlling that technologies, equipments going to China. And the outbound investment is this new-ish tool because there's no controlled money investment, right? So that's not under the export controls and current trade regulations. So this outbound investment restriction and whatever rules that are potentially coming out next year would put further restrictions on how money can be used to invest in certain technologies.
That's really interesting. I mean, first of all, I want to acknowledge right here that I think I actually had it wrong when I asked my question, and I said that the CHIPS Act included some export controls within it. I think somehow I've lumped that all together in my head, because what I'm hearing here is CHIPS Act is an executive function incentive to do things in the U.S., and then the export controls are coming from commerce, which I did know. I just didn't realize how separate they were, but to restrict the outbound flow of things. And the money point that Feifei brings up is interesting to me. The thing that comes to mind is that I think a few years ago, when this all first started, there was a lot of talk of Tesla shifting a lot of their R&D to China, because they were so convinced it was going to be the biggest market for them, that if they develop the technology in China, then it's not a US technology. And so then they can develop the Chinese market as they want. And so I'm sure there's lots of long-term thinking going on. If I invest in a company over there and I actually own it, by the time I'm done investing, maybe it's a minority investment and then I grow it over time, a joint venture that I take over, it's not a Chinese company anymore. So does that, count? What are the specific definitions and loopholes for these things? So yeah, the flow of capital is certainly the next frontier, it seems, in this effort. Feifei, I want to stick with you for the next question, which is, how do all of these things impact existing business contracts and relationships? I mean, are people expected to sever ongoing work to comply with these? Or has the enforcement so far, or the kind of attitude from the government, tended to focus more on new things that haven't yet begun?
I think when the outbound investment rules come out, it's going to be more focused on future investment, not what you have already invested in China. Although we would say to our clients that if you are in these highly sensitive areas, people have already started looking at what they have in China and possible implications, what they need to do. On the enforcement front, the export controls rules that Matt was just describing came out only a year ago, and enforcement takes time. So there hasn't really been, as you were asking, intensive enforcement actions involving these issues. And there are questions from Congress, from industry, on how effective those export controls rules have been in preventing the chips from going to China. As Matt was saying, you can buy a little bit modified chips that's in compliance with the rules, and that get into China can be used for further manufacturing chips. And I know there have been licenses granted. So those are, I think, shows it's hard to completely decouple from China all of a sudden. The rules last year came out that surprised some people. So to prevent disrupting the supply chain, there are licenses granted for certain export of those controlled chips and technologies. But according to BIS, they are ramping up enforcement, and the DOJ's National Security Division under the Biden administration. I think over 300 Chinese companies have been added to the entity list. And recently, both the BIS and DOJ have mentioned that they're working with local and federal prosecutors, different federal agencies, to ramp up the enforcement of these export controls tools. And the National Security Division of the DOJ has also added 25 new prosecutors. So I think the enforcement is coming. It just takes time to build up the cases.
Sure. So, I mean, I remember we spoke on Friday before today's webinar, and you mentioned the hiring numbers, the numbers of prosecutors that they're hiring at DOJ and other places, the increased collaboration between DOJ and FBI. I mean, that certainly points to a seriousness of their intent, at least.
Mm-hmm.
The BIS entity list, just to confirm my own understanding, if a company's added to the entity list, that's immediate. You can't send money to them the week after they're on the entity list because you already promised to. Is that accurate?
Yeah. So, and if I could just jump in, so, and this is where the importance of the to Feifei's point about the funds versus items, right? Hardware, software, technology. So entity list is not a financial restriction, which is why we're looking at outbound investment rules and why OFAC, not to add in more alphabet soup of agencies, but why OFAC at the Treasury Department has economic sanctions. But from the Commerce Department standpoint, yes, it's generally immediate. There is typically a savings clause that would allow for, literally goods on board a carrier to complete, their journey. But after that point in time, right, unless you have something like at the port that day that's en route, it's going to be an immediate effect. And the route, as Feifei mentioned, is licensing, right? And would the government issue a license that allowed for a certain pre-existing activity? In many cases, the answer is no. In some cases, the answer is yes. It's going to depend on, the case-by-case analysis there and what the licensing policy is. But yes, these have immediate effect. And the intention is to not allow for parties to, essentially think of creative ways to minimize the impact of those rules, like stockpiling, right? I mean, as we've gone through the years and all, parties have understood the potentials for any of those implications, there's been a lot of stockpiling, right? Of building out inventory so that accounting for worst case scenarios. And so, by imposing an immediate effect, it's trying to limit those sorts of measures. And the same applies for sanctions, right? The idea is you sanction someone, it's immediate impact because otherwise someone can move their money out of the US financial system. So the desire is to have an effect immediately, while still, and I think this goes to your earlier question, allowing for companies that are entangled to try to disentangle themselves as much as they can, right? So it's very often there are wind down authorizations or other permissions that allow you to divest, to exit, but not to continue, right? And that's where policy determinations come into play.
Well, yeah, because I could see a scenario where a U.S. company maybe already sent $60 million to a Chinese supplier. The boat's halfway across the ocean. If that were cut off before they could take receipt of those goods, that would harm the American companies significantly more than the Chinese company that the regulation may have been intended to impugn. So, it makes sense to me that there's various ways that actually plays out. And thinking about the export controls one on semiconductors in particular, as I understand it, a lot of the export controls haven't, even the original batches haven't even come into full effect yet. There's certain parts of them that go into effect in tranches or in batches. And I think some don't even go into effect until January 2024. And then furthermore, building a semiconductor fab is not like a 3 or 6 month effort. So even if they shipped equipment there, a year ago, those things take years to assemble and tune and calibrate and bring online. And so any chips we're seeing today, what I've gathered from listening to people who know more about this than myself, any chip we're seeing today is the output of a fab that began construction a very, very long time ago. And that, not much of that equipment recently entered China. So, to see the full effect of this, I think will take time. Isaac?
Yes, I'll speak to that from a policy perspective. Your analogy, your description of the $60 million goods, what the US government is trying to do is raise the costs for American companies to invest and entangle with China and to be supporting of the Communist Party of China. And so the various restrictions, some of the policy ambiguity do raise the regulatory and PR costs for American companies investing there. And it's a way for them to do this without having to deal with too much of the bureaucratic infighting between, say, Treasury and Commerce and Treasury and State on some of these issues.
That makes sense. And it actually segues really nicely to the next question I was going to ask you, which is, using the phrase you just coined, to raise the cost of doing business with China. There was an announcement in the past couple of days, I think, that further export controls would be underway after this new Huawei phone came out. It's like, oh, we're not doing enough, despite the fact, as we just identified, there's long lag times here. But how do you measure raising the costs? Like, are they basically just, sticking their finger in the air and being like, well, people don't seem sufficiently distressed about doing business with China, so we're just going to keep raising the cost? Or put more simply, are more U.S. laws, rules, and guidelines expected? And if so, from your perch, looking more at the policy side of things and the business side of things rather than the specific legal side of things, where do you think those new sources of friction or raising the cost might come from?
It's funny, there's three major reasons why US companies are pulling back from China, and none of them have that much to do with the United States. So the first is the Chinese economic slowdown. The second is Xi Jinping's strong leftward turn and the restrictions on US foreign and Chinese businesses in China. So, what happened to Alibaba, what's happened to Meituan, what happened to Baofan of China Renaissance. None of these things have that much to do with the US. You could say, oh, Xi Jinping is increasingly in his own mind besieged by enemies, domestic and foreign, and therefore is cracking down. That doesn't, to me, seem like the most plausible scenario. It seems this is what he has intended and he is executing this plan. And the third is rising geopolitical tensions with Russia, Ukraine, with Israel, Palestine, with China and the US, the increasing likelihood of a war between China and Taiwan and US involvement. And then I'd probably put US actions, fourth or fifth on that list. So we just want to make sure when we're talking about these things, and I know that the structure is US restrictions, but to understand why companies are doing what they're doing. I would say from a US company response, we really recommend knowing who you're working with in China. The law that has the most teeth is the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. And that's the one that's gotten the most scrutiny. It's also the one that's the hardest to defend against, because you can say, listen, in order to legally get around the semiconductor restriction, I worked with a subsidiary or a company that's not on the entity list, and I did this in a fully legal way. Making that argument for the UFLPA, even if you can make it legally, does have much higher PR costs of, hey, I wasn't directly working with this company that's complicit with genocide. I was working with another company that's only orthogonally complicit with genocide. It doesn't stand up in the same way. The final thing I'll say on this is, for companies that are watching this closely, the next area is PLA companies. And it's less about civil military fusion and more about the fact that, as folks on this call and webinar know, the PLA is the armed wing of the Communist Party. It's not a separate entity. So, Bank of China, for example, is part of the same organization that the PLA is part of. And so figuring out the ways in which Chinese partners of yours are entangled with the PLA is a very good use of due diligence.
You mentioned that the Uyghur Forced Labor Protection Act has the most teeth of the various regulations. What do those teeth look like?
So there's what's called a rebuttable presumption, and I'm not a lawyer, and we have two excellent lawyers on the panel who can talk about the details of this more concretely. But the idea is that any good that comes from Xinjiang into the United States is presumed to have been made with forced labor, unless you can prove otherwise. And it's very difficult to prove that otherwise. The other issue is that it's not only goods that come in Xinjiang. Because of what's called the pairing program, or forced transfer of Uyghurs from Xinjiang to other parts of China. You can have a factory in Jiangsu where the supply chain doesn't go to Xinjiang, but where the factory has used, say, 3 or 4 Uyghur laborers who are there effectively as slaves, and that will also come under the UFLPA. The other thing that makes this more complicated is that you could have a factory where the CEO of the factory has said something praising the policies in Xinjiang, and he might not be sourcing from Xinjiang. The factory might not have ties, but that in itself is a risk factor. And so both from a PR perspective, but also from a regulatory perspective and from a congressional scrutiny perspective, this is the law that we've seen the most attention on from the various China committees and subcommittees in the House, and also from journalists who are working on this. Because again, there's not a full sense, oh, well, this American company is buying semiconductors, doesn't have the same press attachment that, hey, this company is benefiting from slave labor in China does.
So I want to ask Matt a question about this. When it comes to the Uyghur Forced Labor Protection Act, but also kind of all these things, there's a fairly expansive view of it. And it reminds me of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act enforcement from, whatever that was. I can't remember when the whole wave of FCPA work related to China began, but like 2005 to maybe 2015 or something like that. And it was just incredibly expansive, to the point where they were prosecuting German companies for stuff they did in Africa because the payments crossed US bank systems, you know, and there wasn't even an America angle to the behavior. That's really expansive. It's a distinctly US way of approaching regulatory things. And it sounds a little bit like that mentality is in play with the Forced Labor Protection Act, because as Isaac was just saying, you know, the what did you call it? The assumption of
rebuttable presumption.
Rebuttable presumption. Yes.
Yeah, it's like unless you can prove otherwise, it's basically guilty until proven innocent, you know, essentially for business purposes. And it's a kind of inversion of how you would normally think about getting in trouble. Is I get in trouble because I did something wrong, whereas in this case you could get in trouble because there's a medium high probability that someone you were working with may have done something wrong. Can you tell us a little bit about the expansiveness of these things, both the forced labor specifically, but also the other ones?
Yeah, and it's funny you say, because I think the government would say, and this is a common refrain from the Commerce Department, of sort of a small yard, high fence approach, right? Where the idea is focus on a narrow issue of US government importance, but impose really strict restrictions on what you can do there. So forced labor is a large priority, significant priority of the Biden administration. And UFLPA, the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, is a congressional statute, right, intended to prevent any products derived from forced labor by any means, right, to Isaac's point, right, from coming into the United States. So it's a narrow issue, right, of US imports of goods that derive from that region. But when you look at how do you implement, it's, as you said, incredibly broad, because it is rebuttable presumption and it's direct or indirect. So companies, you know, we're dealing with clients that are really forced to dig into their supply chains, second, third, fourth, fifth tier suppliers. And this is where, you know, third parties can also help in terms of screening software and vendor, you know, solutions and the use of AI tools to really help understand your supply chain, because these companies typically don't know like their fifth level of where their goods are coming from. But if they have, if it is from that region, it is a rebuttable presumption. And also to establish that, as I said, to establish that it's not from the Xinjiang region is very challenging, and it requires a lot of documentation, a lot of record keeping, and spending a lot of resources that a significant number of US companies haven't typically devoted to US import compliance. So it's really reshifting the focus, you know, from what is a narrow scoping of issues, but incredibly broad restrictions that require a significant amount of resources to ensure you're on the right side of that law or those rules. And it's even, you know, you find it, just one final point, because when you switch to the outbound investment piece of this, that's another common issue that we're seeing, or common, you know, comment we're hearing from folks is, well, it wasn't prohibited 20 years ago to invest in a Chinese semiconductor company. Why am I being penalized for an investment that I made 10, 15 years ago to generate financial income, was totally legally compliant? But now, you know, with these new rules, it's becoming very challenging to maintain those investments, or, you know, or you're being forced to divest at a time at which, you know, for a transaction that was legally compliant at the time you made it. And that's a common challenge that we see. But frankly, you know, the government would say there are compelling national security and foreign policy reasons as to why these rules are crafted as they are. We try to craft them as narrowly as we can, but that's a consequence of doing business in China. And to Isaac's, I think it's an excellent point. They're sending a message that if to continue to do business in China, you have to be wary of the fact that new rules could come and upend those plans. And so you have to have a strategic plan going in and understand what are your exit strategies or mitigation strategies in the event new rules come into play that sort of change your calculus from when you first entered the market.
Sure. Fei, oh, go ahead. I was going to go to you.
I would just add 2 points on that. So even though I agree the UFLPA is very broad, it's hard to prove, because you don't, like, if your goods are detained by the Customs and Border Protection, you have to trace even beyond the fifth level. You have to map the whole supply chain. But on the other hand, CBP does not have a lot of resources. So their enforcement, they can't just enforce against every single company that possibly has a touch point with Xinjiang. So there have been specific sectors that are under more scrutiny than others. And so that's one issue. And the other is the complication, as you know, Bob, you were asking about the China side, is this is a very, very sensitive issue. And China in recent years passed so many different regulations to govern like a data transfer, to govern what kind of due diligence work you can do in China. There's the anti-foreign sanctions law, there's the new revised anti-espionage law. So all these complex sets of regulations on both sides is making everything very challenging for companies doing business in both worlds to navigate.
I think Feifei is making an excellent point there. And I really want to emphasize that companies need to hive off their Chinese staff from a lot of this work, not because the staff isn't brilliant or better at this work than many of the American staffers, but because they're a lot more vulnerable to pressure from Beijing, both judicially and extrajudicially. And so for seeking to figure out how much a supply chain, say, is exposed to Xinjiang, you have to do that outside of China, and you have to do that with entities that have minimal China exposure, because otherwise you're going to get someone in trouble. We also strongly discourage companies from sending questionnaires to their suppliers asking if they're using forced labor, because you're basically incentivizing your suppliers to lie to you, because they could say, yes, we're sourcing from Xinjiang, and then get the relationship cut off and potentially raise the ire of a local government official for shining light on this issue. Or they can lie and say they have no exposure to Xinjiang, and then you have a document that you try to bring to CBP that is clearly false in certain cases. And so the best way to do these things is to do them outside of China, to screen your supply chains, and then to quietly remove the partners that have high exposure to Xinjiang. It's also a better way to keep more positive supplier relationships, because you're not saying, hey, you're in violation of the UFLPA, which is why I'm cutting you, but you're saying this is part of a general reorganization. It's usually a lot smoother that way.
Yeah. Plus, if you say you're moving away because of the UFLPA, then that, there's a long memory there, and so if you try to do something else in China, that could be held against you, which makes sense. It's funny what you said about hiving off the China teams to not work on some of this more sensitive stuff. And I was speaking with a partner at a major global accounting and consulting firm last week, and they said that they don't have their China-based teams work on due diligence projects anymore. They do a lot of the other stuff, market mapping, upside consulting, innovation, strategy, what can we do in the future, but they're not working on the downside protection stuff like due diligence and risk management because of what you just said. Their search traffic, their computers are all vulnerable, and they may, offend people or get in trouble. So they're doing all that work outside of China, which of course brings in a whole new tranche of concerns, such as access to certain databases and certain types of data, ability to talk to people on the ground while doing the research. It all becomes desktop based by definition, and very restricted desktop at that.
I think the situation has changed so much since you and I were active there doing similar kind of work, Bob, a decade or so ago. And companies have to not jeopardize the safety of their employers. And there's so many, we've seen it all over the news, and there's so many of these stories that haven't been reported yet of companies getting harassed and people getting arrested or worse. And we just have to be very explicit that the burden of that falls so much heavier on Chinese staff or staff who have American or other passports and who are of Chinese heritage. That's who Beijing targets. And those are often the people who know the most about the situation. But, companies have a choice. Like, yes, I can send someone to a factory and I can talk to people on the ground, but I could be jeopardizing the safety of the people that I'm talking to and the people who are having those conversations. And so this is really a safer model.
It's funny that the last thing you said there, one of my main talking points when I'm talking to people in any context about this type of stuff is they say, oh, the crackdown on foreign businesses in China. And I'm like, whoa. There's been some of that, but make no mistake that the people who have borne the brunt of the change in atmosphere in China are Chinese companies. They are having a way worse time in China than American companies in China are having. And they also don't have the choice to relocate or decouple or whatever you want to call it. And so yeah, the brunt of this really has fallen on Chinese companies and Chinese executives and workers. I think that's a frequently overlooked point from our vantage point. I want to go back to Feifei with a question that was kind of niggling at me when I was listening to you guys talk about the forced labor stuff. Is, don't we have forced labor protection laws globally? You know, like not just for China, and how do these laws with regards to China differ from, like, I'm assuming I would get in trouble if I knowingly had forced labor products from any other part of the world in my supply chain. So what gives there?
Well, it's funny you mentioned that because I was just looking at some reporting on forced labor in Michigan and Florida, but I think those issues, they don't raise to the level of geopolitical tension that's been going on between US and China. And this, as we have discussed, a lot of these sanctions, export controls, and congressional legislations are also tools for foreign relations in a way, and for protecting national security. So yes, there are forced labor laws, like ESG has been a big topic in recent years, and that covers labor practices. But I think for China, it just raised the level higher because of the tension between the two countries. And there are, not just in the US, like in Germany, I think there's in Germany, there's the German Supply Chain Act. In Norway, they have something similar that says you have to do due diligence on your whole supply chain to make sure you're not using, you're not violating any human rights in producing what you're producing.
And I'll just add one quick point too. I mean, I think the issue, I think, as Isaac first alluded to, spoke to, is the rebuttable presumption piece from the Xinjiang region, right? So there are forced labor import rules, but the fact that there is a rebuttable presumption for any good from this particular region, direct or indirect, is what greatly expands these forced labor restrictions specific to this issue, right? And so that's where I think the difference is, in terms of, because there are forced labor rules, but to establish a rebuttable presumption is unique, and what creates the particular compliance challenges, and how do you demonstrate, how do you rebut that presumption, right? And how can you put together a paper, a record-keeping file sufficient to satisfy U.S. Customs that forced labor is not used, and that is a tremendous challenge.
Right.
These are looking to reduce both regulatory risk and PR risk. And every once in a while, someone will say to me, "Hey, Isaac, I took your advice and we moved from China to Burma." And I say, no. Not saying go to do that, but one has to understand that from a US regulatory perspective and from a PR perspective, American consumers and American regulators are far more concerned about sourcing from China than they are from sourcing from other places in the world that also have equal, and in some cases worse, human rights concerns. So we have to understand that the policy risks here are not only because of serious human rights concerns in China, but because of very serious national security concerns and perception among US policymakers that US businesses need to reduce their exposure to China.
Got it. And one of the questions from the audience here, and first of all, I want to actually make sure the audience is aware there's a question and answer function at the bottom of the screen, and you can submit questions. I make no guarantee that we will ask your question, or at least all of them, depending on where the conversation goes. But one right now is pretty relevant, which is just if anyone, maybe Isaac from the policy side, could give just like a short answer to describe the scale of the forced labor in Xinjiang based on like what we know. There's obviously like a range from like things we know for sure to things that we kind of guess at. But based on what we know, what's the scale we're looking at? Some other locations were mentioned, about other places where there might be forced labor. Is it mainly political, the motivation, or does there seem to be an actual empirical difference in the nature of the problem that also feeds into how it's being solved?
So, great question. There's been a lot of excellent reporting, both from journalists at the New York Times, Washington Post, Axios, but also from Sheffield Hallam, from several academics in the States, that have very concrete examples, ASPE as well, of forced labor in Xinjiang. The broad point I'll make is I don't know of any atrocity where, when the dust settles, things weren't as bad as we thought. Xinjiang is an incredibly difficult place to report from, and we have very little insight into what's actually going on in the ground. And my assumption is that, at some point when the archives are opened, whether that's months or years or decades, we'll find that this was a lot worse than we had thought.
Yeah, it's obviously a broad stroke, but I take your point that, very few times were things actually better than we thought they were. Or maybe summed up, where there's smoke, there's fire, and if we're seeing the smoke, there might be even worse things going on. Fei, I want to come back to you with a change the direction a little bit. You touched on it before, but I want to kind of delve into it a little bit more fully. What about the Chinese side of the equation? It's certainly become less seemingly friendly or simple to do business in China for foreign companies, but are we seeing any specific regulations or requirements that are making it harder to do business there, just like at a procedural level? Obviously, it's harder to do business there, but at the regulatory level, are we seeing new things emerge from the Chinese side of this equation?
I would say for multinational companies, all the data regulations is making all of our clients and other companies changing the way they maintain and use their data from China, and that impacts for us to doing investigation work, doing compliance work, due diligence work involving China. But on the other hand, I would also say that China needs foreign investment right now, given the current state of economy. And the message has been that these legislative developments and recent enforcement actions against certain foreign firms are not intended to apply to all non-Chinese companies as a deterrence. It's more it targets it, kind of like what the US saying, right? Like, we're not trying to make things difficult for everybody. We're doing this to protect targeted national security interests. So I think both sides are doing the same thing, which is making companies doing business in both countries lives harder.
Got it. I don't know if Matt or Isaac, either of you have further thoughts on like the Chinese regulatory apparatus.
I would just echo what Fei said, and probably because we do a lot of similar things. And coming in from the US perspective, right, we're working with a lot of multinationals that have a presence in China, and the data privacy rules that are evolving, and also, to my understanding, on export PhD law, but vague, right, and not yet enforced, and hard to understand what is considered, sensitive information for multinationals that have both US citizens and Chinese citizens on the ground in China, understanding, their exposure, right? Because there is a safety issue here as well, but understanding their exposure in the event they even inadvertently share information that the Chinese government then determines is sensitive, right, is a significant concern for our clients, and for any company that has a presence in China that could be dealing in even a sector that you wouldn't consider to be sensitive from a, they're not government contractor, they're not dealing in classified information, but just even, technologically sensitive information, right? That could be deemed, critical to PRC government interests, where there is exposure for parties who share that information cross-border in a way they shouldn't have, without even really knowing the rules. So it's actually a really key challenge that the multinational companies, both in the US and elsewhere, are trying to navigate.
I think one thing that companies miss is the risks of getting swept up in a corruption campaign. So the former chairman of the Bank of China was just arrested for allegedly on corruption. And as we all know, we don't need to say alleged, because he's going to be found guilty. That's how the Chinese justice system works for cases like this. So for American companies that worked closely with the Bank of China over the period where this gentleman was the chairman, they now have increased risks of being investigated themselves. And Beijing is very comfortable, and obviously not a monolith, but factors in Beijing are very comfortable changing the laws or applying the laws in certain ways to suit themselves, or by thinking that they are above the law. And so it's a very challenging regulatory environment, because American companies try really hard to follow Chinese law, usually, broadly speaking, more than Chinese companies do, because Chinese companies understand that, you know, 上有政策,下有对策, like above there are the laws, below there are the ways around the laws, and that's the way the system is intended. But it's very, very difficult. And so there's no good way to do it, but it's just another risk of doing business in this cross-jurisdictional market.
What about Europe? Europe has a lot of standards around these things already. I forget who it was, but mentioned that, you know, Germany, I think Feifei mentioned Germany has the supply chain law, and they've taken things very seriously for a long time. They have certainly had some tensions with China in the past couple of years, the same as the US. And there's been a lot of talk over there of de-risking and balancing, but they seem a little bit less zero-sum about it. You know, every time the US and China do something, or particularly the US laws, it feels like they're really going for a straight punch to the nose, you know, with the CHIPS Act and the restriction on US persons, with the export controls, and seeing progress and be like, we have to stop the progress on the semiconductors. We're going to try to stop that. Whereas the European approach may be a little less direct. What are we seeing over there regulatory wise?
Well, I mentioned two, from like one from Germany, one from Norway. I think there are two voices, as the, you know, I'm not a European expert, but I've seen is, on one hand, yes, as Bob, you're saying, there are regulations and discussions to restrict or to restrict doing business with China in some ways. But on the other hand, I've also seen reports saying, well, Europe doesn't want to follow US just blindly, like whatever US is doing, we'll do the same, because it hurts their economy as well. You can't just have the entire Europe and the US decouple from China overnight. So I think I'm saying both, but on the export controls front, maybe Matt can add more. The US has been working with the Netherlands and other countries to roll out similar semiconductor export controls to require companies maybe seeking licenses before exporting certain chips or technologies to China. So in that way, it's US is working hard to align with allies to roll out regulations to achieve the same the US national security goals. But China is also probably going around talking to different countries, trying to align with others to counter what US is doing.
Yeah, and I could add, I mean, I think that's right, what Feifei said. I mean, I think, putting politics aside, one of the hallmarks of the Trump administration was a willingness to act unilaterally when it comes to these, you know, decisions in terms of imposing export controls or sanctions or taking action, whereas the Biden administration is more focused on acting multilaterally, and that is across the board when it comes to sanctions, export controls, as Feifei said. I mean, they're the Netherlands and Japan, because the semiconductor supply chain is a very uniquely defined supply chain where there are certain countries that have certain technology and they're the leaders, right? So the U.S. has looked to act in coordination with the Netherlands and Japan to impose export control restrictions on China in a way that is balanced, right? It's sort of coordinated. The Trump administration sort of tended to act a little bit more cavalierly when it comes to, you know, the restrictions and moving ahead to further U.S. interests, and not necessarily in as close lockstep to some of our other, you know, other U.S. allies. So I think, you know, to the extent we see things, we're going to see it more multilaterally than unilaterally, but that's sort of what I've seen, you know, for the last few years.
European companies have to be very, very careful on data protection, which is much more of a policy priority in Europe than in the United States. So companies that have large exposure to Europe need to figure out how to square Beijing's increasingly encompassing data sharing laws with European data privacy laws.
Yeah, I mean, the data stuff is interesting because China is one of the first, maybe the first, especially large economy country to have this idea of digital sovereignty. You know, for them, in America, by contrast, it's like, if it's on the internet, we all just kind of assume it's like out there globally, like nothing you can do about it. In the words of Bill Clinton, you can't pin Jell-O to the wall, or you can't nail Jell-O to the wall. If it's on the internet, there it is. Whereas China's like, no, our internet border is the same as our physical border. and we will decide what goes in and out. You need a license to export corn, and you need a license to export data. And it's a really interesting approach that they're kind of uniquely able to actually have because of all the infrastructure they've been building for decades around the Great Firewall. And on the one hand, it's quote unquote draconian, or seems, really antithetical to the internet or to the global liberal order. But on the other hand, like, there's certain aspects of it that almost seem prescient, like there's probably things we will wish we could do that for here in the US. Like if we wanted to do export controls on the use of LLM technology, how are we going to restrict the flow of digital access? We don't have the infrastructure to enforce that. China does. And I'm not praising them, by the way. I'm just pointing out that we're entering uncharted territory here as we seek to control the flow of these things. And it's just from an abstract, almost philosophical perspective, it's interesting to think about. If data is the new oil, well, how do you restrict that in the same way as you do the movement of a physical commodity?
Yeah, and I'll say, I think it's interesting. Interesting philosophical and technical. There's some technical elements there too from the export controls and sanction side, because in the U.S. export control framework, there's a concept of published information, and published information is not subject to U.S. export controls. So you could have a company, right, that says, I'm going to open source, right? And this is with GitHub and other open source repositories. That code is not subject to export controls because it's available on the internet for anyone to freely and anonymously use, right? And so that is reflected. It's not just it's an interesting philosophical point too, and sort of a larger geopolitical point. But from a technical standpoint, the US does not regulate, even information that might be related to some control technology, but is open sourced for anyone to see. And so it is an interesting parallel between how the US and other governments, and particularly how China is treating their information. Even if information may not have been considered sensitive before, they might retroactively consider it sensitive after a release. So it's quite opposite in terms of how both companies are treating data and information.
That's an excellent point, Matt. And the other issue that European companies and American companies have to face is, what do you do when someone linked to, say, the Ministry of State Security or the PLA hacks into your data illegally? And do you disclose that to European regulators? Do you disclose that to your bosses at home? Do you disclose that to anyone in China? Do you try to pave it over quietly? There's a lot of these issues that companies have been facing for decades in China, that because of the real national security implications and the increasing lawfare that we're seeing from the US and also Europe, especially the UK, on these issues, that companies need to think long and hard about how to protect themselves from that.
I think
I would just add, if there is a hack that implicates certain data, there are regulatory and legal obligations to report. It's not just like, hey, can I pay them off and not say anything?
But yeah. I think it's a great point, Fei-Fei, and companies should really take that advice, because sometimes, especially when people are in China and afraid of upsetting local partners there, they don't.
I think a buzzword that just emerged in this conversation, which we won't have time nor the expertise probably to dive into for real, is open source. I know, for example, in the case of semiconductors, RISC-V is an open source paradigm for chip architecture that is not quite at the bleeding edge, but getting closer to the bleeding edge of many semiconductor technologies. And it's open source, to your point. So if I'm standing in Milwaukee and I'm open sourcing something on the internet for anyone to use, is it possible to restrict that to not include China? And how would you enforce that? Because then you get into freedom of speech and freedom of internet type stuff. It's quite a thorny idea, but I'm going to intentionally blunt the conversation there because we only have a few minutes left. And I want to ask one more audience question, and then we'll move to close it down. The question comes from a gentleman named James Doyle. We're seeing companies like Temu enter the US and UK markets in a large way. Temu, for those who don't know, is the kind of Western consumer-facing brand of Pinduoduo, a big Chinese e-com platform. Do you see the recent laws leading to new ones, which will make it difficult for Chinese-based companies to do business in the US or the UK along the lines of Temu? So let's address this in two parts here. One is, do you see it getting harder for these Chinese companies to operate in, let's say, the UK and the US, just to keep it simple? And then two, specifically related to the forced labor stuff as part of James's question.
Right.
So,
I think.
Oh, go ahead, Fei, please.
Well, I think it depends on what the companies, what they do, right? Like if you're selling clothes, then maybe the forced labor supply chain issues of a high priority, but maybe not so much national security issues. So what we tell our clients, and I'm sure Matt, you guys probably do something similar, is to advise clients to risk assessments to find out where their operations, whether their operations and products have national security risks. And if that's the case, maybe yes, it is getting more challenging. You have to talk to lawyers and figure out your plan Bs and plan Cs, benchmarking with industry, and just monitor regulatory enforcement trends. But so I think it really depends on the company.
I think we need to understand that a lot of these Chinese companies are going overseas, not as part of a grand Beijing strategy, but because they're deathly afraid of being so focused on China because they've seen what's happened to their peers. And they want to reduce their own risk. And they understand that today's China is a very difficult place to be an entrepreneur. So they are in a very difficult situation because they also have to a degree, advance Beijing's strategies in order to survive in both markets. So I don't envy the position that they're in. I think it's very, a company like TikTok, for example, many people in the company would just rather it be a American or a global company, but it's not. It can't be. Beijing won't allow that. And so it's a tough thing for entrepreneurs and regulators and policymakers and consumers to understand that this is the operation. This is where the Chinese companies are operating in. I would hope that people at Temu and at TikTok at a senior level, have a very good sense of who the PLA, MSS, et cetera, plants are in their company and understand that that's a cost of doing business with the system that they're in.
I'll just add very quickly. I mean, I think these are all great points, and I agree with them all. One sort of technical piece. I mean, just to answer the question, I do think that these rules are evolving. The U.S. government is looking at ways in which rules might be changed to address concerns. We haven't talked about the China Select Committee, sort of a congressional entity body that is looking for. They've called out Temu specifically for forced labor issues. That committee is sort of looking at a host of issues, and there's one very, without going too deep in the weeds, a technical concept called the de minimis point, right? Where if you are below a certain dollar amount, I believe it's $800 currently, you don't have to provide customs entry forms, right? It's meant to sort of exempt low dollar value imports. And so the China Select Committee has said, well, we should lower that threshold, particularly for Chinese import. It's hard to say exactly how you operationalize this, but to look for situations where e-commerce platforms in particular, where they're dealing with low dollar value shipments, might not, and this is to Fei-Fei's point, you can't catch everything, right? And these shipments that are low dollar value are not being caught within the normal CBP system. And so, that is something that we could see change in the future to get at e-commerce, where there's just a huge volume of smaller dollar value imports. So there's always something on the horizon that the government is thinking about, the U.S. government is thinking about, to try to counter, what they perceive to be security and policy issues.
Well, the Select Committee is kind of intimidating to me as an American, because it's sort of a hammer looking for a nail. Like there's no one specific problem that they're set up to solve. And so to your point, it's like, well, let's lower the dollar value on the threshold. They're just, kind of like a bull in a china shop or something. They may cause a lot of damage or complication while trying to find the nail that they're going to hit.
I think there's a general sense of, for lack of a better word, naivete on how the U.S. government operates. The U.S. government doesn't do discretion or subtlety. Like the U.S. government is a big machine, and when it goes at something, it goes at something hard. I mean, I still think about the poor folks who don't have TSA pre and take off their shoes at an airport because someone failed on a suicide bombing after 9/11, and 20 plus years later, we're still dealing with that. So I would really caution folks to not think the US government is going to be able to do these things in a very scalpel-like way, and recognize that as tensions grow worse, there's going to be a lot of regulatory overreach and a lot for some reporting requirements and restrictions. I mean, I think back, I Venmoed someone something, and I mentioned North Korea, and the transaction got flagged and I couldn't send it through. And you think that's very close, me saying
I wonder why.
Yeah. There's going to be on all levels, very likely a lot more of that. And so companies should save themselves massive headaches and massive write-downs by dealing with that today.
Makes a lot of sense. The 9/11 shoe removal thing hits close to home. I mean, who doesn't really kind of gnash their teeth when they're confronted with that scenario these days, all these years later, knowing that it never once actually caused a problem, probably not prevented one. Well, look, I'm going to have to cut this off, even though I'd personally love to keep going, because this is the kind of stuff I sit around thinking and talking about most of the time anyway. But thank you all for joining us. This was really wonderful conversation. I want to mention one other thing before we go, which is that, at a few points in this session, we talked about complying with laws and how it's getting harder and harder to find reliable sources of information on China. About 3 years ago, the China Project, my team and I began ideating around data products that could solve systemic information gaps between China and the world. And these stem from problems we ourselves were experiencing in our daily journalistic work. And after a couple of iterations and trials, we do have a new product called ChinaEDGE, which provides direct real-time access to official Chinese corporate records. We make those records available in both the original Chinese and also translated into English. You can see the corporate register details, specific shareholders and ownership structures, officers and directors, operational histories, legal alerts, and more on more than 200 million corporate entities registered in China. Given your interest in this webinar and managing risk and increasing transparency with regards to China and increasing certainty of doing business with China, I'm assuming many people in this audience may at least want to know that this exists, if not use it immediately. So we may follow up with you in the weeks to follow with just some basic information on that, and if you want to do a demo or something. But in the meantime, we're going to continue holding a series of events around this and related topics. And the next one will be towards the end of this month, and we'll send you all information on it soon. The next topic is going to be on the ownership structures of Chinese tech giants, the specific owners and the relationships between them. For example, very few people seem to be aware that most of the largest shareholders in ByteDance, TikTok's parent company, are in fact US investment funds that invested in ByteDance very early on in its corporate development. So when we hear Congress people railing about this Chinese app, I mean, little do we think about the fact that the ultimate beneficial owners of this app, many of them are household name US investment funds. I don't think there's enough consideration going on around that issue. And so we're actually going to do a webinar on that in a few weeks. And all of you will be invited, and we hope to see you there. Thank you again to the panelists, to all of our audience members for joining. And yeah, have a good rest of your week. It's the beginning of the week, so have fun out there.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
See you all.
Bye.
Bye-bye.